These days, the resurrection is believed to have never happened, considering it was an event that happened 2,000 years ago. However, when you look at the evidence of it both from inside the religion and outside of it, the evidence can potentially be shocking to many. So let's sit back and look at the evidence together. The resurrection isn't just a belief of the Christian faith. It's the foundation that proves the faith and is one of the most important events in the belief. As St. Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 17, "If Christ has not been raised, your faith is futile. But is there any evidence for the resurrection? Or is it just a myth?" Let's start with the empty tomb. All four Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, agree that Jesus was buried in a tomb, and that the tomb was empty on Easter Sunday. But here's the thing. The empty tomb wasn't just a claim made by Christians. Even non-Christian sources and historical findings point to the fact that the tomb was empty. For example, the Toldat Yeshu, a Jewish text from the early medieval period, acknowledges that Jesus' tomb was empty. But instead of accepting the resurrection, it claims that Jesus' body was moved by a gardener. Why would Jewish sources even bother to explain the empty tomb if it wasn't a historical fact? They didn't deny the tomb was empty, they just came up with alternative explanations. Another example comes from the Roman historian Tacitus. In his work Annals, he confirms that Jesus was executed under Pontius Pilate. While he doesn't mention the empty tomb directly, his account aligns with the historical context of Jesus' death and burial. And then there's the Nazareth inscription. This is a Roman decree from the 1st century that warns against disturbing tombs. Many scholars believe it was issued in response to the spread of Christianity and the empty tomb story. Why would the Romans care about tomb disturbances unless something significant had happened? The empty tomb was a well-known fact, even among Jesus' enemies. These non-Christian sources and historical findings confirm that the tomb was empty, and they can't be dismissed as Christian propaganda. They're part of the historical record. The empty tomb is a fact, and it's the first piece of evidence for the resurrection. Why would they do that? Because the tomb was empty, and they needed an explanation. But think about it. If the disciples had stolen the body, why would they willingly die for a lie? The empty tomb is a historical fact, and it's the first piece of evidence for the resurrection. Next, let's talk about the post-resurrection appearances. After his resurrection, Jesus appeared to over 500 people, including his disciples, Mary Magdalene, and even skeptics like James and Paul. These weren't hallucinations or visions. The Gospels describe Jesus eating with his disciples, letting Thomas touch his wounds, and appearing to large groups of people. And here's the crazy thing. Many of these witnesses were willing to die for what they saw. People don't die for something they know is a lie. The post-resurrection appearances are powerful evidence that Jesus really rose from the dead. Now, let's look at the transformation of the disciples. Before the resurrection, Jesus' followers were scared, confused, and ready to give up. Peter even denied Jesus 3 times. But after the resurrection, they were completely changed. They went from hiding in fear to boldly proclaiming the gospel, even in the face of persecution and death. What caused this transformation? They saw the risen Jesus. As Acts 4 verse 20 says, "We cannot but speak of what we have seen and heard." The disciples' transformation is another powerful piece of evidence for the resurrection. Next, let's talk about the early Christian creeds. In 1 Corinthians chapter 15 verse 3 to 8, Paul quotes an ancient creed that dates back to within 5 years of Jesus' death. This creed lists the key facts of the gospel: that Jesus died, was buried, rose on the 3rd day, and appeared to Peter, the 12, and over 500 others. Why is this important? Because it shows that the resurrection wasn't a later legend. It was a core belief of the earliest Christians. The resurrection is rooted in history, not myth. Now, let's talk about Paul. Before his conversion, Paul, then known as Saul, was a fierce persecutor of Christians. He approved of Stephen's stoning, and hunted down believers. But on the road to Damascus, Paul encountered the risen Jesus. This encounter changed him completely. He went from persecutor to apostle, spreading the gospel across the Roman Empire. Paul's conversion is hard to explain unless Jesus really rose from the dead. Why would a man like Paul give up everything, his status, his power, his safety, for a lie? Paul's conversion is another powerful piece of evidence for the resurrection. Now, let's talk about the Shroud of Turin. This ancient linen cloth bears the image of a crucified man, and many believe it's the burial shroud of Jesus. Scientific studies have shown that the image on the shroud wasn't painted or forged. It's a mystery how it was formed. but it matches the details of Jesus' crucifixion described in the Gospels. Finally, let's talk about the historical impact of the resurrection. In just a few centuries, Christianity went from a small Jewish sect to the dominant religion of the Roman Empire. How did this happen? Because the resurrection is true. People saw the risen Jesus, and they couldn't keep it to themselves. The resurrection changed the world, and it's still changing lives today. Thanks for watching. If you found this video helpful, hit that like button, subscribe, and share it with someone who might need to hear this. Until next time, God bless.